In the spring of 1453, a Persian army of unprecedented scale gathered at the borders of the Greek city-state of Thermopolis. 120,000 soldiers, reinforced by cavalry from the steppes, siege engineers from Mesopotamia, and archers trained since childhood. They came to end something that had lasted 3 centuries. They came to crush the last remnants of a civilization that refused to kneel. And waiting for them, in a narrow mountain pass, was General Marcus Theodore. With barely 15,000 men, he had no reinforcements. He had no hope of escape. But what he possessed was something the Persian Empire had forgotten: the will of free people defending their home. When the battle drums fell silent that evening, the mountain pass would run red with blood. The earth would tremble beneath the weight of the fallen, and a small nation would have written its final chapter, not in surrender, but in defiance. This is the story of Thermopolis. This is how mortals held back empires. Thermopolis had not always been isolated. Once, the city was part of a great alliance. Trade flowed through its markets. Ships from across the Mediterranean anchored in its harbor. But over 40 years, the Persian Empire had systematically dismantled every alliance, conquered every rival city, and isolated Thermopolis like a hunter isolating prey from its herd. The city had petitioned Rome for help. The Senate offered sympathy, but no soldiers. It had sent envoys to the Egyptian kingdoms. They sent prayers, but no weapons. By 1453, Thermopolis stood alone. The walls of the city had been built by ancestors long dead, stone upon stone, forming ramparts that had withstood earthquakes and invasions for nearly 4 centuries. But walls alone could not stop the Persian war machine. Walls could only delay the inevitable. The city council had debated for weeks. Some advocated surrender, arguing that negotiation might preserve at least some of their freedoms. Others demanded the city be abandoned, that the people flee into the mountains and preserve the bloodline of Thermopolis in exile. But General Marcus had stood before them and made a choice that would echo through the ages. He had refused both options. Instead, he proposed something that seemed suicidal. He proposed resistance. Marcus Theodore had been born in these mountains. As a child, he had learned to climb these peaks before he could properly walk. As a young man, he had hunted across these valleys, learning every ridge, every hidden path, every place where water pooled in dry seasons. Unlike the Persian generals who studied maps drawn by cartographers who had never visited the land, Marcus carried the mountains in his memory, and he understood something the Persians did not. Numbers meant nothing in terrain where numbers could not be deployed. The Persian army's strength was in its ability to overwhelm through formation, through disciplined cavalry charges, through the coordination of hundreds of thousands moving as a single organism. But in a narrow mountain pass, that strength became a curse. In a place where only a few hundred men could stand abreast, an army of 120,000 became just another target. Marcus began his preparations immediately. He abandoned the city and withdrew his forces to a narrow pass called the Gates of Thermopolis, located 7 miles northeast of the city walls. The pass was barely 300 meters wide at its narrowest point, with sheer stone walls rising 500 meters on either side. Behind the pass lay a maze of smaller valleys and hidden settlements where the city's civilians had been evacuated. Before the pass lay the road where the Persian army would have to advance. There was no way around it. There was no alternate route. If the Persians wanted to reach Thermopolis, they would have to come through the gates, and the gates would be prepared. For 3 weeks, Marcus worked. 3 weeks of relentless preparation while Persian scouts probed the pass and reported back to their generals that the Greeks were indeed holed up in the mountains like trapped animals. The Persians believed they had already won. They simply had to walk forward and collect their prize. Behind the reports reaching Persian command was the most detailed trap a general could conceive. On the western cliff face, Marcus positioned archers and light infantry. On the eastern cliff face, he placed crossbowmen and javelin throwers. Both cliffs faced inward, creating a deadly funnel. Directly across the narrowest point of the pass, he ordered a palisade of sharpened stakes and wooden walls to be constructed. Behind this wall, his heavy infantry would make their stand. But Marcus was not simply creating a defensive line. He was creating something far more ambitious. He was turning the entire pass into a killing ground. Hidden above the pass, in carved niches that had once housed ancient temples, he positioned engineers with massive boulders suspended on wooden frames. When released, these boulders would cascade down onto the Persian formations below. In a hidden ravine to the north, he concealed his cavalry reserve, his last card, to be played only at the moment of maximum impact. Water supplies were carefully rationed. Every soldier knew they would have exactly one skin per day. Food was distributed in measured portions. Marcus did not speak of hope or victory. He spoke only of duty. He spoke of the men and women of Thermopolis who were counting on them. He spoke of the ancestors buried in the city's necropolis and the descendants not yet born who would inherit either freedom or slavery, depending on what happened in the next hours. The morning the Persians arrived was deceptively quiet. The sky was pale blue, almost white in its brightness. There was no wind. The temperature was already climbing toward uncomfortable heat. From his position behind the palisade, Marcus watched through a gap in the wooden wall as the first Persian scouts emerged from the southern exit of the pass. They rode slowly, confidently, in formation. Behind them came more scouts, then light cavalry, then the first columns of heavy infantry. The Persian general in command was Xerxes Malik, a man known across the empire for his ruthlessness and his refusal to accept losses. He had conquered 7 kingdoms in 15 years. He had never experienced defeat. The very concept of defeat was, to him, almost theoretical. As his army advanced into the pass, Xerxes rode at the center of the front ranks, visible even from a distance by his gold armor and the massive crimson banner held above him. He looked at the palisade, at the handful of Greek soldiers visible behind it, and something between a smile and a sneer crossed his face. He gestured to his commanders. The order was simple: overwhelm the Greek position, kill everyone, leave no one to carry word of this resistance. The Persians did not see the trap immediately. They saw only the palisade and the thin line of Greek soldiers. What they did not understand was that this line was not meant to hold, it was meant to channel. As the first wave of Persian soldiers charged toward the palisade, Marcus waited. He waited while they covered the first 100 meters. He waited while they covered the next 100. He waited while they came close enough that he could see individual faces, individual expressions of rage and determination. And then, when the Persian formation was tightest, when the maximum number of soldiers were squeezed into the narrowest point of the pass, Marcus gave the signal. The first sound was not a shout or a horn blast. It was a creaking groan as wooden supports holding the suspended boulders were released. For an instant, there was nothing. Then the sky above the Persian formation seemed to darken. The boulders, each the size of a man's torso, began to fall. They fell silently at first. The only sound, the whisper of air. Then they hit. The impact was not quick or merciful. It was catastrophic. The first boulder struck the center of the Persian formation and bounced, crushing dozens of soldiers beneath its weight before crashing into the cliff wall below. Before the Persians could react, the second boulder fell, then the third, then dozens more, released from hidden positions all along the upper cliffs. In seconds, hundreds of Persian soldiers were dead or dying, crushed beneath stone and the weight of their own comrades who had fallen on top of them. Panic is a virus among soldiers. It spreads faster than any weapon. As the boulders fell, Persian soldiers pushed backward, trying to escape. But behind them came more soldiers, still advancing, not understanding what was happening. The formation that had looked so organized and terrifying became a crush of bodies, each man pressing against the next, trying to survive. And in this moment of chaos, Marcus unleashed the second phase. From the western cliff face, archers began firing. The arrows came in waves, hundreds at a time, raining down on the confused Persian formation. The men on the eastern cliff added their fire. What had been a narrow pass became a valley of death, with arrows coming from both sides simultaneously. Persians raised shields to protect from above, but arrows came from the flanks, They turned to flee, but the crush of their own soldiers prevented escape. Some tried to climb the cliff walls, scrabbling desperately for handholds on the sheer stone. Others dropped their weapons and armor, hoping to move faster, but the weight of bodies around them made any movement impossible. In less than 10 minutes, the first assault had left more than 1,000 Persian soldiers dead. The pass was now a horror of twisted bodies, spilled blood, and scattered weapons. The surviving Persians retreated to reorganize, and for a moment, there was silence. Even the sounds of the wounded seemed muted, as if the pass itself was stunned by what had happened. Xerxes was not a man who accepted setbacks easily. From his position at the rear of his army, he could see what had happened to the first assault. He could see the pass was more than just a defensive line. It was an ambush site that had been carefully engineered. Experienced commanders would have either withdrawn or adapted their strategy significantly. Xerxes did neither. Instead, he gave an order that would define the battle. He ordered a full frontal assault, using not just the frontline soldiers, but entire reserves. He would throw weight and numbers at the problem until it broke. The logic was simple. Thermopolis had maybe 10,000 men. Xerxes had 120,000. Even if he lost 10,000 soldiers, he would still have 10-to-1 advantage. He could afford the losses. Thermopolis could not. What Xerxes did not understand was that numbers meant nothing in a narrow pass. 10 men could be as effective as 10,000 if the space allowed only 10 men to fight at once. As the Persian commanders reorganized, Marcus made his own adjustment. He recognized that the next assault would be different, larger, more sustained, more desperate. He pulled his heavy infantry back by 50 meters. Instead of holding at the palisade, they would now retreat into a narrower section of the pass, a natural bottleneck where the stone walls came closest together. The palisade would be abandoned, but that was strategic. Xerxes would believe he was winning, that he was pushing the Greeks back. In reality, he was being herded deeper into the trap. The second assault began before the first casualties had even stopped bleeding. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers advanced into the pass. This time they moved with shields locked and formation tight. Learning from what had happened before, they expected arrows from above, but the Greeks had already stopped firing from the cliffs. Instead, the arrows came from behind the Greek palisade, from Greek soldiers who seemed to be falling back. The Persians pressed forward, believing they were pushing the Greeks into retreat. What they didn't understand was that every step forward was taking them deeper into terrain, even more favorable to the defenders. At the narrowest point of the pass, just as the Persians believed victory was within reach, Marcus revealed his final preparation. Along the stone walls, at the narrowest bottleneck, Greek soldiers had dug small trenches and covered them with branches and earth. As the Persian soldiers rushed forward, the ground beneath them gave way. Men fell into concealed pits, breaking legs and arms, becoming obstacles for the soldiers behind them. The passage narrowed even more as bodies filled it. And from behind these pits, standing on higher ground, the Greek heavy infantry emerged with spears and shields. They had been waiting in this exact position, in this exact configuration, for this exact moment. The Greek spearmen lowered their weapons. The Persian soldiers, already disoriented by falling comrades and unexpected terrain, suddenly found themselves face to face with an organized, well-positioned defensive line. For the first time in the battle, the two sides met shield to shield, spear to spear. And in that moment, something remarkable happened. The Greeks did not break. Hour after hour, the battle raged in the pass. The Persians threw assault after assault at the Greek line. The Greeks held. Sometimes they were pushed back a few meters, but the narrowness of the pass meant that no matter how many Persians attacked, only a limited number could engage at once. It became not a battle of numbers, but a battle of endurance, of courage, of the willingness to stand when retreat seemed easier. By midday, the Persian soldiers had begun to understand the reality of their situation. They were not overwhelming an enemy. They were throwing their lives against a wall that refused to fall. Some commanders began to suggest withdrawal, regrouping. finding an alternative route around the pass. Xerxes refused to hear it. His pride, his reputation, and his belief in the inevitability of Persian victory had become a single, unified thing. To retreat now would be unthinkable. So he ordered fresh reserves forward. Thousands more soldiers entered the pass, added to the pressure, threw themselves against the Greek line. And still the Greeks held. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the pass, Marcus saw something in the Persian assault that others might have missed. The attacks were becoming less coordinated. The formations were breaking down. The Persians were beginning to fight individuals rather than maintain unit cohesion. It was the sign of an army approaching its breaking point. Marcus made a single gesture to his cavalry commander waiting in the hidden ravine. The order passed through runners, and the cavalry force emerged from concealment. The cavalry charge was perfectly timed. The Persian army, already exhausted, already pushed to its limits, suddenly found itself under attack from a direction it hadn't anticipated. The cavalry didn't charge directly into the center of the Persian force. That would have been suicidal. Instead, the Greek cavalry attacked the flanks and the rear, where Persian soldiers were less organized, where formations were thinner. The impact was not just physical, it was psychological. For the first time, it became clear to the Persian soldiers that they were not fighting a desperate, cornered enemy. They were fighting an enemy that had been preparing, strategizing, setting traps, an enemy that still had reserves, an enemy that possessed not just courage but tactical genius. And in that moment, something shifted in the hearts of the Persian soldiers. Fear replaced confidence. Doubt replaced certainty. The assault faltered. Persian commanders shouted orders to reform, to regroup, to face the cavalry threat. But in doing so, they lost pressure on the Greek infantry line. And the Greek infantry, seeing the Persian formation weaken, surged forward. It was subtle, not a massive breakthrough, but a gradual pushing forward, yard by yard. The Greeks used the terrain they knew perfectly, the formations they had drilled 1,000 times. They moved as one organism, shields interlocked, spears in unison. The Persians, by contrast, were becoming increasingly chaotic. Orders conflicted, formations fragmented. Soldiers who had been told they were unstoppable were now having to accept that they might actually be defeated. By sunset, the battle had fundamentally changed. What had been a Persian assault on a Greek defensive position had become a Persian retreat from an advancing Greek army. The pass, which had seemed like it would be the site of a glorious Persian victory that morning, had become a nightmare of dead and dying soldiers, of defeat, of a shattered belief in imperial invincibility. Xerxes, watching from the rear of his army, finally gave the order to withdraw. The order was transmitted through commanders, but by that point, many soldiers needed no order. They were already retreating, already leaving behind their dead, already fleeing toward the southern exits of the pass. The Greek soldiers did not pursue recklessly. Marcus held them back, knowing that pursuing an army into open ground away from the protection of the pass could be deadly. Instead, the Greeks advanced carefully, maintaining formation, keeping discipline. They collected the weapons of the dead, tended to their wounded, and established a new defensive line at the southern exit of the pass. The Persians would have to stop to reorganize, and that night would be spent in retreat, in defeat, in the bitter understanding that they had not crushed a small nation, but had been stopped by it. As darkness fell over the pass, Greek soldiers lit torches. The flames flickered against the stone walls, illuminating the bodies of the fallen. The equipment scattered across the ground, the evidence of a day when an empire had been held back by men who refused to surrender. Marcus did not celebrate. He moved among his soldiers, speaking quietly, acknowledging their sacrifice, ensuring the wounded were being treated. He knew the next days would be difficult. The Persian army had not been destroyed, merely defeated in this one place. But in this one place, something fundamental had changed. In the days that followed, news of the battle spread across Europe like fire through dry grass. A small nation had defeated an empire. A general named Marcus had stopped Xerxes, where the historians had said Xerxes was unstoppable. The bells of every church from Rome to Constantinople, rang in celebration. Kings who had refused to send aid suddenly wrote letters of congratulation. The Pope declared Marcus a champion of Christendom. Traveling merchants carried the story from port to port, and with each telling, it grew slightly more impossible, slightly more miraculous. But the reality was in some ways even more profound than the legend. At Thermopolis, something had been proven that the empires of the world had nearly forgotten. It had been proven that no matter how large, how wealthy, how disciplined an army was, it could be defeated by a people fighting for their home, fighting for their lives, fighting with the knowledge that surrender meant the end of everything they cherished. Marcus returned to Thermopolis, but he did not return as a conqueror. He returned as a man who had been changed by what he had ordered, by the blood that had been spilled, by the bodies that had been left in the pass. He had ordered men to die so that others might live. That weight would never leave him. But he also knew that those deaths had not been meaningless. Thermopolis had survived. The city that had stood alone against the empire still stood. And because Thermopolis had stood, other cities took courage. Other nations began to believe that resistance was possible. The narrative of inevitable Persian expansion, of empires that could not be stopped, of history's predetermined course, that narrative had been broken on a frozen battlefield by men who refused to accept their own extinction. The battle at Thermopolis became a symbol not just of military victory, but of something deeper, the resistance of the human spirit against overwhelming odds. It became a story that would be told for centuries, a story that would inspire people who faced their own seemingly impossible struggles. The Persian Empire would not rest after Thermopolis. Xerxes returned with new armies, still determined to crush the defiant principality. But the empire would never recapture that sense of inevitable victory. The myth of invincibility had been broken, and Marcus, in the years that followed, would fight many more battles to defend Thermopolis. Sometimes he would win. Sometimes he would be forced to retreat. Sometimes he would negotiate from a position of strength rather than weakness. The small nation would endure not through a single victory but through decades of resistance, through strategic brilliance, through the willingness of its people to sacrifice for their freedom. But it would all trace back to one moment in time, to one frozen pass, to one general who looked at overwhelming odds and decided that surrender was unthinkable, that the only acceptable choice was to prepare, to be ready, and to trust in the genius of position and preparation, to believe that courage and intelligence could sometimes overcome mere numbers. That is what Thermopolis meant to the ancient world. That is why the story still echoes today. When empires seem unstoppable, when the odds appear overwhelming, when history seems to be moving in one inevitable direction, the battle at Thermopolis reminds us that history is not predetermined. It is written by the choices of men and women who decide that the struggle is worth the cost. And sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible is possible. The frozen pass held, the empire was stopped, and the world understood that even the mightiest power could be challenged by those with the will to resist and the wisdom to fight on terrain and terms of their own choosing. If you've journeyed with us through the ancient snow of Thermopolis, if you've felt the weight of impossible choices and the triumph of the unbowed spirit, then subscribe now, because the next great battle is already gathering on the horizon, and there are countless stories of courage, strategy, and defiance waiting to be told. Don't miss the turning points of history that changed civilizations forever. Make sure to hit that notification bell, because legends are waiting to be discovered.